What if the story of human civilization you were taught is only a fraction of the truth? What if, before the Bible was written, before Yahweh's name was spoken, there were gods, black gods, whose names once carried the weight of creation, justice, and life itself? These gods did not live in myth alone. They shaped kingdoms, raised monuments, and guided the rise of civilizations that flourished long before scripture was inked on scrolls. Yet their memory has been buried. When we open school textbooks, we are told of Greece and Rome, of prophets and patriarchs, of empires built under Yahweh's shadow. But what about Nubia? What about Cush? What about Kemet, the land we call Egypt, rooted in Africa, not Europe? What about the gods who stood at the center of those civilizations, the divine forces that inspired their science, art, and law? These gods were not abstractions. Osiris presided over death and resurrection, teaching humanity that endings were never final. Isis embodied healing and motherhood, showing that love itself was divine. Ptah spoke the world into existence long before Genesis declared that God said, "Let there be light." Ma'at held the feather of truth, ensuring that justice was woven into the very order of the cosmos. These were not minor deities. They were the architects of civilization, the gods who stood at the foundation of human society. So why are they not celebrated in the same breath as the Bible's patriarchs? Why are their names whispered only by scholars or hidden in mythological footnotes? The answer lies in erasure. The civilizations they built, the wisdom they preserved, the divine systems they lived by all had to be forgotten for a new story to rise. A story where Yahweh was the sole God, where Israel stood alone as chosen, where Europe claimed itself as the heir to civilization. But erasure is never complete. Even in the Bible, fragments of older truths linger. Stories of floods, of gardens, of resurrection echo myths told millennia earlier along the Nile. Even in European art, the faces of Isis and Horus live on as Mary and Jesus, transformed but not destroyed. Even in the spiritual practices of the African diaspora, the Orishas, Vodun spirits, and ancestral rites carry forward the memory of gods who refuse to die. The silence before the story is not empty. It is full of voices waiting to be heard again. To begin this journey is to strip away the veil of empire and doctrine, to see that before the Bible, before Yahweh, before Rome, there were black gods who built the world's first civilizations. Their history was forbidden, but it is not gone. And if their memory still lingers beneath the surface, then perhaps civilization as we know it is not what we have been told. Perhaps the true story begins not with prophets in deserts, but with gods along the Nile, the Niger, and the ancient kingdoms of Africa. If the silence before the Bible hides forgotten gods, then the lands they ruled still whisper their names. For before Israel carved its commandments, before Rome raised its temples, there were kingdoms whose foundations were not only political or economic, but spiritual. In Africa, the gods were not confined to the heavens. They walked with the people, breathed through the earth, and infused the very stones of cities that would outlast empires. Nubia, often overshadowed by its northern neighbor, was one of the earliest cradles of this sacred civilization. Its rulers built pyramids long before the Bible spoke of Solomon's temple. Its priests invoked gods whose powers stretched across the Nile, guardians of fertility, justice, and war. Cush, too, rose with gods at its center, forging dynasties that ruled not only their own lands but even Egypt itself. In these kingdoms, divinity was not foreign, it was family. To honor the gods was to honor the ancestors, for the line between human and divine was never as rigid as later religions claimed. And then there was Kemet, ancient Egypt, the jewel of Africa, the land that Europe would later try to claim as its own. Here, civilization itself was imagined as a reflection of divine order. Pharaohs ruled not as kings but as incarnations of Horus, entrusted with maintaining Ma'at, the balance of the universe. Architecture was theology in stone. Pyramids mirrored the rays of the sun, temples aligned with the stars, statues immortalized gods who were both cosmic and personal. The gods were not distant, abstract beings. They were present in the flood of the Nile, in the fertility of the soil, in the breath of life itself. Osiris, the resurrected Lord, was not only a figure of myth, but the archetype of kingship. Every ruler was his heir, every tomb a portal to his domain. Isis, the mother goddess, taught that compassion and magic were forces of civilization as vital as laws or armies. Ta, the craftsman god, gave artisans their skill, shaping civilization as much with hands as with words. Anubis, guardian of the dead, ensured continuity, that death would not sever the order of society, but carry it forward into eternity. What unified these civilizations was the belief that gods and people were inseparable. Justice was divine, labor was divine, birth, death, renewal, all divine. A farmer planting seeds honored Osiris. A mother nursing her child invoked Isis. A craftsman carving stone echoed Ta. The sacred was not hidden in temples alone. It was woven into every act of life. This vision of civilization was not only advanced, it was holistic, binding society together through shared reverence of gods who looked like the people themselves. And it is here that we begin to see why their history was forbidden. For if humanity admits that Nubia, Kush, and Kemet built civilizations guided by black gods, then the narrative of the Bible as the first revelation, of Europe as the cradle of wisdom, begins to collapse. The foundations of modern theology tremble when we acknowledge that before Abraham wandered deserts, Osiris ruled over life and death, and Isis taught the meaning of love. The kingdoms raised by these gods were not primitive, as colonizers claimed. They were luminous, sophisticated, and enduring. Their ruins still stand as testimony. Their gods still whisper in stone and sand. And their legacy asks us the question empire feared most. What if the world's first civilizations were guided not by Yahweh, but by black gods whose names still echo beneath history's silence? Civilizations are not only built with stone and labor, they are built with stories. Myths are blueprints of meaning, maps of the unseen, guiding people in how to live, love, die, and hope. And long before the Bible's pages were written, the myths of the black gods shaped humanity's understanding of creation, justice, and eternity. These were not children's tales, they were sacred frameworks that formed the very structure of civilization. Consider the myth of Osiris. His murder by Set and resurrection through Isis was more than a story of gods. It was a lesson that death is not the end, that justice, though delayed, triumphs, that love has the power to restore what was broken. Every burial ritual in Egypt echoed this myth, promising ordinary people that they too could rise beyond death. It was the first theology of resurrection centuries before Christ. Or look to Ma'at, not a goddess of war or conquest, but of balance, truth, and cosmic harmony. Her feather determined the fate of every soul. This myth taught that justice was not arbitrary. Kings were not above it. Wealth could not buy it. Even pharaohs stood before Ma'at's scale, their hearts weighed against truth. In a world that often glorifies might, Ma'at declared that only righteousness sustains the universe. Then there is Ptah, the craftsman god, who dreamed creation into existence through the power of the Word. Before, "In the beginning was the Word" was written in John's Gospel, Ptah was already honored as the god who spoke the world into being. His myth carried the revolutionary idea that creation comes not only from force but from thought, speech, and imagination, that words hold the power to shape reality. Isis, too, carried myths that transformed civilization. Her devotion to Osiris, her protection of Horus, her healing magic, these stories elevated compassion, motherhood, and feminine wisdom to divine status. She was proof that the sacred is not only in the spear of the warrior, but in the embrace of the mother. And through her myth, the feminine was honored as a power equal to the masculine. Even Anubis, often feared for his jackal face, told a myth of guidance rather than terror. He led souls through the darkness, ensured proper rites, and stood as protector of the vulnerable dead. His presence taught that death was not chaos, but order, a passage that could be navigated with care, dignity, and hope. These myths were not isolated. They bled into every aspect of culture, art, law, ethics, festivals. They taught communities that the sacred is woven into justice, that death is part of life's cycle, that truth outweighs power, that creation begins with the spoken word. They offered a worldview where humanity was not abandoned in chaos but embraced in cosmic order. And this is why later empires sought to suppress them, because these myths carried truths that empowered people, that taught them they did not need priests to access eternity, that divinity was not the monopoly of a single god but a symphony of powers reflected in the people themselves. To remember these myths is to remember a time when civilization was built not on fear but on balance, not on exclusivity but on plurality. The myths of the black gods shaped humanity before the Bible ever spoke, and their echoes still live today in resurrection stories, in final judgments, in words of creation, in mothers cradling sons. They were buried, but they were never lost. And if their myths shaped civilization, then their images, the very faces carved in stone, reveal even more about who these gods were and who the people who worshipped them saw in the divine. If myths carried the wisdom of the black gods, their images carried their presence. For to carve a god in stone, to paint them on walls, to crown them in gold, was not mere art. It was theology in flesh. It was the declaration that divinity looked like the people themselves. And in Nubia, in Kush, in Kemet, the gods were depicted with dark skin, wide noses, full lips, coiled hair, unmistakably African. Osiris, often shown with black or green skin, was not imagined as pale or distant. His color symbolized fertility, the richness of the Nile, the renewal of life from soil. Isis, carved with the grace of African queens, carried crowns of thrones and wings that wrapped protectively around her people. Ma'at, feather on her head, radiated beauty inseparable from justice. Anubis, though jackal-headed, was painted with the deep tones of the land, his body marked with the shades of Africa. Ta, Hathor, Horus, all bore features rooted in the people who made them. This mattered, because when you look at your gods and see your own face reflected, you know that the divine is not foreign. You know that your skin, your body, your culture are sacred. The earliest civilizations were not built by people worshipping gods who looked nothing like them. They built their temples to gods whose features mirrored their own. And here lies one of the deepest reasons for erasure. Later empires, especially Europe, could not allow the image of God to remain black. For to admit that divinity wore African features would shatter the myth of white supremacy. And so the chisels of colonizers did more than break statues. They broke faces. They repainted walls, lightened skin tones, recast Osiris, Isis, and Horus into figures resembling Europeans. Centuries later, Christian art cemented the transformation. God as a white-bearded patriarch, Jesus as a pale man with blue eyes, Mary as a porcelain mother. But the older images still survive. In tombs untouched, on papyrus scrolls, on monuments defaced but not erased, the black features of the gods remain. Archaeologists have seen them. Travelers have documented them. The evidence is there, undeniable. The gods of early civilization were not European. They were African. And this truth changes everything. Because once you see Osiris with black skin, you see how resurrection was never foreign to Africa. Once you see Isis as a black mother, you see how compassion and magic were always African gifts. Once you see Ma'at with African beauty, you know that justice was born in the heart of black civilization. The church and empire tried to sever this connection by replacing divine images with their own. But images are powerful. They plant themselves in memory. in culture, in subconscious identity. And even when forbidden, they survive. The true faces of the gods still gaze at us from stone, waiting to be recognized again. And if images carry such power, then so too do names. For the next weapon of erasure was not only to repaint the gods, but to strip them of their names and replace them with silence or condemnation. Civilizations rise on names. To speak a name is to summon presence, to connect memory with meaning, to keep alive what might otherwise fade. The ancients knew this. They inscribed their gods' names on temples, whispered them in prayers, sang them in ceremonies, carved them into stone so that eternity itself would echo with their power. Osiris, Isis, Ma'at, Ptah, Anubis, Hathor, Horus, Shango, Oshun, Yemaya. Each name carried worlds inside it. Each name connected the living to the eternal. But when empire and church set out to rewrite history, they began with the names. For to erase a name is to sever its power. To condemn a name is to poison its memory. The black gods who had ruled life and death were not only ignored their names, were transformed into warnings. The Bible speaks of false gods and idols, yet rarely names them. Baal and Asherah appear, but only as figures of condemnation, never described in their true beauty or wisdom. In truth, many of these so-called idols were ancient black gods and goddesses worshipped across Africa and the Near East. Their names were silenced in scripture so thoroughly that generations would grow up never knowing the gods their ancestors once honored. Later, when Christianity spread, this erasure became sharper. Isis, whose image shaped the Virgin Mary, was no longer named in reverence but dismissed as pagan. Osiris, whose resurrection prefigured Christ, was dismissed as myth. Ma'at, whose feather-weighed truth, was forgotten altogether. And in West Africa, as Orisha traditions crossed the Atlantic with the enslaved, their names were demonized. Shango became the devil, Oshun a seductress, Yemaya a witch. Why this relentless attack on names? Because names hold continuity. A people who can name their gods can resist forgetting. A people who speak ancestral names carry dignity in their mouths. Erasure of names ensured that the gods' power became fragmented, their stories scattered, their worship hidden under layers of fear. Yet the names survived, in whispered stories passed down by grandmothers, in songs disguised as Christian hymns, in rituals hidden behind the masks of saints. The enslaved carried them across oceans, disguising them to protect them, but never letting them die. Shango thundered under the guise of Saint Barbara. Oshun's rivers flowed under the Virgin of Charity. Osiris lived in resurrection hymns. Isis hid in Marian devotion. The names endured, even if disguised. And now, those names rise again. Scholars uncover inscriptions once buried. Practitioners reclaim Orishas and Kemetic deities by their true names. The silenced voices of Isis, Ma'at, and Osiris are spoken aloud again. The forbidden names are being restored to memory, their power returning with every utterance. For when you reclaim the names of the gods, you reclaim the truths empire tried to bury. You reclaim history. You reclaim identity. And perhaps most dangerously, you reclaim power. And that is why empire did more than erase names. It also rewrote myths, taking the stories of the black gods and bending them into its own narratives. Names were silenced, but empire knew names alone could not erase memory. The myths themselves carried too much power, too much truth, and so another tactic was used. Not just erasure, but appropriation. The stories of the black gods, Osiris, Isis, Ma'at, Pa, Anubis, were absorbed, reshaped, retold in new tongues. What had once been African wisdom became biblical revelation. What had once been universal myths became the exclusive property of a single God. The clearest example is resurrection. Long before the Gospels told of Jesus rising on the third day, Osiris had already risen, murdered by Set, resurrected through the devotion of Isis. Osiris became lord of the underworld, offering hope that death was not the end. For millennia, Egyptians buried their dead with Osirian prayers, confident they would rise again. When Christ's resurrection was preached centuries later, it carried the same hope, but the original name was erased, or take Maat. Her feather weighed every heart against truth, no matter rank or wealth. This was divine justice, impartial, cosmic, eternal. When the book of Revelation describes the final judgment, with souls weighed and recorded, it echoes Maat's courtroom of eternity. Yet Maat's name was never spoken again in Christian texts. The principle remained. The goddess vanished. Ta, the craftsman god, carried another myth that empire stole. Ta created the world not by violence but by thought and word. He imagined, he spoke, and the world became. Centuries later, the Gospel of John declared, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." The theology was strikingly familiar, yet Ta's name was gone, his legacy hidden beneath new doctrine. Even Isis, the mother goddess, was borrowed. Her images cradling Horus became models for Mary and Jesus. Her healing powers, her role as protector, her symbolism as a mother of divinity were transferred to Mary, but stripped of her agency, her magic, her sovereignty. What had been a goddess of immense power became a passive vessel, rebranded to fit patriarchal control. And Anubis, the guide of souls, the protector of the dead, finds echoes in biblical angels who escort souls to judgment, who guard the afterlife. His role endured, his name condemned. This pattern repeats again and again. Flood myths in Genesis mirror stories from Mesopotamia and Africa. Proverbs echo the wisdom literature of Egypt. Psalms resonate with older hymns sung along the Nile. The Bible, rather than an original revelation, became a mosaic of stories already ancient, stitched together under new authority. But why steal these stories instead of destroying them entirely? Because they were too powerful to erase. The people knew resurrection was real, justice was cosmic, creation was divine speech, mothers were sacred, death was not an end. Empire could not abolish these truths. It could only rebrand them, taking the stories of the black gods and claiming them as its own. Yet once you trace the roots, the illusion breaks. The Bible ceases to look like a singular divine revelation and reveals itself as an edited collection, an appropriation of far older truths. And when you see this, you realize the gods were never defeated. Their stories survived, hidden in the very texts meant to erase them. And if their myths could be stolen, so too could their rituals. What once was dance, drum, and offering was reshaped into liturgy, hymn, and sacrament. Stories could be rewritten, but myths alone were not enough to sustain civilization. Rituals made the sacred tangible. They carried divine truths into the body, into rhythm, into community. In Nubia, Kush, and Kemet, rituals honored gods with song, dance, incense, libations, offerings, and sacred festivals that mirrored the cycles of nature. These were not mere ceremonies, they were acts of alignment between humanity and the cosmos. And when empire sought to erase the black gods, it did not destroy these rituals outright. It reshaped them. The beating of drums, once a call to the Orishas or to Osiris in the land of the dead, was forbidden under empire. Yet the rhythm endured, resurfacing in hymns, organ chords, and chants. The pulse that once carried Shango's thunder now echoed in Christian liturgy. The voice of the drum was silenced in name but not in spirit. Libations poured to ancestors, once a daily practice, were condemned as necromancy, but the act returned as sacraments. Wine poured at the altar, once a gift to Osiris and the spirits of the dead, became the blood of Christ. Water poured to Yemaya, to the Nile, to the ancestors, was reborn as baptismal rites. The gesture survived, renamed and repurposed. Festivals that honored the cycles of life and harvest were outlawed. yet their rhythms continued. The festival of Osiris, where death and resurrection were celebrated in communal processions, became Easter. The birth of Horus, the child of Isis, became Christmas, marking the rising sun after winter solstice. Pagan gods were renamed saints. Sacred days were redated. Ritual time itself was stolen, ensuring the people would continue to celebrate the old gods while believing they honored the new. Even sacred meals were reshaped. Offerings of bread, honey, and grain to the gods were recast as communion. The sacred act of sharing food with the divine, as old as civilization itself, was given a new narrative but carried the same heart. To eat with God was to become one with God. The ritual lived on, stripped of its original names. The most striking theft was the temple itself. Egyptian priests led ceremonies where incense rose to heaven, prayers were chanted, and worshippers knelt before carved figures of gods. When Christian churches were built, they mirrored this structure: incense, chanting, kneeling, and altars. What had been condemned as idolatry was recreated under a new label. The architecture of worship itself was borrowed. Why reshape rather than erase? Because rituals are embodied memory. They live in the muscle, in the senses, in the rhythms of community. Empire knew that if rituals were erased completely, people would resist. But if rituals were renamed, disguised, or claimed by new gods, the body would still remember, even as the mind was redirected. Yet the disguise was never perfect. Those who looked closely could see the echoes. They noticed how Mary resembled Isis, how Easter resembled Osiris, how wine resembled libation. The gods endured not only in myth but in practice. Hiding in the very faith meant to erase them. And if rituals could survive beneath new names, then so too could the wisdom they carried. For beneath the stolen ceremonies, the philosophy of the black gods continued to pulse, a philosophy empire could never fully suppress. Rituals were the heartbeat of devotion, but behind them lay a philosophy, a way of seeing the universe. The civilizations of Nubia, Kush, and Kemet were not only advanced in engineering and art, they carried a worldview rooted in balance, justice, and harmony with the natural world. This philosophy, embodied by the black gods, guided daily life as much as it guided kings. And it was this wisdom, perhaps more than anything else, that empire feared. At the center of this philosophy stood Ma'at. She was not simply a goddess, she was a principle, a law older than law, the truth that the cosmos itself demanded balance. Her feather weighed every heart, not only in death, but in life, for rulers were expected to govern by her order. Justice was not optional. Harmony with nature was not superstition. Truth was not negotiable. To live outside of balance was to unravel the world itself. This idea shaped everything. Farmers timed their planting to the Nile's flood, knowing that fertility was divine cooperation. Judges consulted priests, believing that truth was cosmic, not personal. Even architecture aligned with the stars, mirroring heaven on earth. Civilization was not imagined as domination of nature, but as harmony with it. Humanity thrived by moving with the cycles, not against them. The Bible's later focus on obedience and fear of Yahweh reveals a stark contrast. Whereas the gods of Africa taught balance, Yahweh demanded loyalty. Whereas Ma'at weighed truth, Yahweh tested faith. Whereas Isis embodied compassion and healing, Yahweh ruled with wrath and exclusivity. The shift from harmony to fear was not accidental. It was a replacement. For a people guided by balance are free, but a people guided by fear can be controlled. This buried philosophy also carried profound implications for human identity. The body was not sinful, it was divine. Sexuality was not shameful, it was sacred, celebrated in fertility rites, and honored as continuation of life. Death was not terror, but transition, a doorway to renewal. Even suffering was not meaningless, for Osiris himself had died and risen, proving that struggle was part of the eternal cycle. When empire replaced this worldview, humanity was taught the opposite. The body became sinful, nature became cursed, Death became punishment. Spirituality became obedience rather than balance. Fear replaced wisdom, and by severing people from the philosophy of the gods, empire severed them from themselves. Yet wisdom does not die. Even buried, it whispers. The very fact that so many biblical texts echo older African ideas from Proverbs to Psalms to Revelation reveals that the philosophy could not be erased, only repackaged. And in the diaspora, enslaved peoples continued to embody this worldview in their songs, dances, and rituals, honoring harmony with earth and ancestors even under chains. The wisdom of the black gods was buried beneath fear, but it survived in fragments, in echoes, in practices too natural to kill. And today, as memory awakens, this wisdom begins to rise again, calling us back to balance, to truth, to justice. And if philosophy could survive burial, then so too could power, for the gods were not merely teachers of wisdom. They were symbols of resistance, forces that gave people the courage to endure empire's chains and whisper freedom in the darkest nights. Empire tried to bury the black gods under fear, but their memory did not fade. Instead, it transformed into resistance. For a people under conquest, under slavery, under erasure, remembering their gods was not only spiritual, it was survival. These gods, once worshipped in temples of gold and stone, became symbols of courage, whispered in chains, invoked in rebellion, carried in secret as weapons of the soul. Osiris, the Lord who conquered death, became a reminder that no empire could truly destroy a people. If death was only passage, then every fallen ancestor was not lost but standing beside the living. Enslaved Africans carried this truth with them across oceans. Death was not defeat. Every life taken by chains or whip only joined the ranks of protectors in the unseen. Isis, the healer and mother, became the embodiment of endurance. Her myth of resurrecting Osiris taught that love could mend even what empire shattered. Mothers in bondage sang lullabies not only to soothe but to preserve, memory songs layered with names of ancestors and coded invocations of divine compassion. To cradle a child was to echo Isis, to resist despair by planting hope in the next generation. Ma'at became the eternal judge, reminding oppressed peoples that empire's courts were not the final measure of justice. A heart weighed against truth could not be bought, manipulated, or silenced. Even if rulers lied, even if laws were bent, Ma'at's feather promised that ultimate balance would prevail. Justice was not in the hands of conquerors, it was in the very structure of the cosmos. The Orishas carried this spirit too. Shango thundered in the hearts of warriors who refused to kneel. Oshun's rivers flowed in the tears of women who resisted being stripped of dignity. Ogun's iron-inspired revolts forged in plantations, weapons fashioned from tools of labor. These gods were not abstractions, they were present forces, called upon in secret gatherings, fueling both survival and uprising. History records the fear of empire in the face of these gods. Slave masters banned drums because their rhythms carried rebellion. Missionaries outlawed ceremonies because they sparked unity. Colonizers demonized ancestral worship because it gave strength to resist cultural annihilation. Yet every ban revealed the truth. The gods were dangerous because they empowered the oppressed, and in moments of open defiance, their presence was undeniable. The Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave revolt in history, was ignited in part by Vodun ceremonies. Drums thundered, spirits were invoked, and enslaved people rose with courage no empire could comprehend. The gods of Africa marched with them into battle, proving that faith, when rooted in ancestral power, could overturn nations. These gods of resistance remind us that spirituality is never neutral. It can be used to chain or to free. Empire used Yahweh to justify conquest, demanding obedience and silence. But the black gods offered balance, justice, love, and courage. They whispered to the enslaved, "You are not forsaken. You are divine. Rise." And if their memory could spark revolts, then their survival was never just about history. It was about the future, about carrying power forward until the day the gods could rise openly once more. When open resistance was punished with death, survival required disguise. The black gods could not be named aloud, their rituals forbidden, their images shattered, but the people who carried them were ingenious. They wrapped their gods in new clothing, hid their voices in songs, concealed their altars in plain sight, in shadows, in whispers, in the rhythm of daily life. The gods endured. On plantations in the Americas, enslaved Africans were forced to kneel before the cross, yet in their hearts, they knelt to their own gods. Shango thundered in the beat of drums disguised as festive music. Oshun's sweetness lived in dances that slave masters called play, but were prayers to rivers and fertility. Ogun's iron was invoked in the sharpening of tools, every blade carrying hidden reverence. Christian saints became masks. In Cuba, Shango was called Saint Barbara. Oshun became Our Lady of Charity, and Ogun was cloaked in Saint George. In Brazil, Candomblé cloaked Orishas in Catholic imagery, keeping them alive beneath the gaze of priests. In Haiti, Vodun thrived, its spirits honored under the veneer of Christian prayers. The enslaved outwardly bowed to the god of their oppressors, but beneath the surface, they spoke with their own. Songs carried codes. Spirituals in the American South, sung in fields and chapels, were more than laments. They were maps, messages, prayers to the gods of freedom. Swing low, sweet chariot, echoed with Anubis guiding souls home. Wade in the water was both a path to escape and a whisper of Oshun's rivers. Every melody hid double meanings, carrying the gods in notes that overseers mistook for submission. Even in death, the gods survived. Burial practices disguised as Christian funerals carried the old rites. Libations poured, prayers whispered, symbols traced in dirt. Anubis still guided. Osiris still promised renewal, even if his name was forbidden. Ancestors remained honored, their presence concealed beneath church-approved rituals. The resilience was astonishing. Empire thought it had replaced the gods with Yahweh, but in reality, the gods lived in the very structures of the new faith. The church bells rang in rhythms that echoed drums. The incense of Catholic Mass resembled the offerings once burned to Isis and Pa. Communion mirrored the sacred meals shared with Osiris. The gods hid in plain sight, disguised by empire's own tools. This hidden survival was not weakness. It was strategy, for the gods knew their time would return. Memory stored in ritual does not vanish. It sleeps, and when it wakes, it carries centuries of strength with it. Today, scholars trace these disguises with awe. Anthropologists study Candomblé, Santeria, and Vodun, realizing that what they once dismissed as syncretism was in fact survival, the gods refusing to die. Practitioners reclaim their names, peeling away the masks, honoring the resilience of ancestors who kept the fire alive in silence. The gods were hidden, but never gone. They survived in shadows, waiting for the moment the world would once again speak their names without fear. And as the silence breaks, the forbidden begins to return not as fragments, but as a rising tide. For centuries, the gods lived in silence, hidden in saints, disguised in rituals, whispered in songs. But shadows never last forever. What was once concealed is now being spoken aloud. Across the globe, from Africa to the Americas, the black gods are returning to open worship. Their names, once forbidden, are being called again. Their images, once destroyed, are being painted anew. Their power, once feared, is flowing back into the world. In Brazil, devotees of Candomblé honor the Orishas openly, their festivals drawing thousands. Rivers overflow with offerings to Oshun, seas ripple with gifts to Yemaya. Thunderclaps are celebrated as Shango's voice. In Cuba, Santeria practitioners proudly declare their devotion to Ogun, Obatala, and Shango, no longer cloaked in Catholic names. In Haiti, Vodun is not a relic of survival but a thriving faith, guiding entire communities in healing, justice, and identity. In Africa itself, younger generations are reclaiming ancestral practices suppressed under colonial rule. Yoruba cosmology is taught, Ma'at is studied as philosophy, and Kemetic spirituality finds new life. Temples rise again, not as reconstructions of the past, but as declarations of continuity. The gods were never defeated, only hidden. In the West, where erasure worked hardest, the return is perhaps the most radical. Artists depict black gods with unapologetic clarity, replacing centuries of European iconography. Scholars uncover inscriptions proving Yahweh was once worshipped alongside Asherah, revealing that even Israel's God had to contend with the divine feminine erased from memory. Social media spreads these discoveries, amplifying the call of the gods across borders empire never imagined. The unmasking terrifies institutions, for if Osiris already ruled resurrection, then Christ is not unique. If Ma'at already weighed hearts, then judgment was never Israel's alone. If Isis already healed and nurtured, then Mary is not singular. If the Orishas still govern thunder, rivers, and iron, then Yahweh is not the only Lord of creation. The monopoly of divinity begins to crack when the gods are unmasked. But the unmasking is not about replacing one god with another. It is about balance. It is about restoring the truth empire tried to bury, that the divine has always been plural, diverse, and deeply rooted in Africa. To honor these gods today is to restore memory, to heal identity, to reject the lie that divinity only flows from deserts and crosses. The gods are no longer content to be whispers. They are rising in festivals, in chants, in prayers, in scholarship, in art. Their return is not only spiritual but cultural, political, and personal. They remind humanity that before the Bible, before empire, before conquest, the black gods built civilizations, taught wisdom, and guided life and death. And as their masks fall, they do more than return. They demand transformation of how we see history, how we see ourselves, how we understand the sacred. For once you see the gods unveiled, you cannot go back to silence. When the gods are unmasked, something profound happens. The wound begins to close. For centuries, colonization and the church inflicted a subtle violence not only on bodies but on souls, convincing entire peoples that their ancestors were cursed, their gods demonic, their rituals shameful. This wound lingered across generations, shaping how black communities saw themselves, their history, even their own reflection in the mirror. To remember the gods is to begin to heal. The healing begins with dignity. To see Osiris again as Lord of Resurrection is to know that Africa carried the promise of eternal life long before Christ. To honor Isis is to reclaim the sacredness of the Black Mother, no longer silenced, but recognized as healer and protector. To speak the name of Ma'at is to stand tall in the knowledge that truth and justice were born in Africa, not imported from Rome. The return of these gods restores a sense of pride, the knowledge that divinity was never foreign, it was always within. Healing continues with identity. For generations, black children grew up seeing images of God that looked nothing like them. Every painting, every stained glass window, every crucifix whispered that divinity was white, European, distant. To reclaim the black gods is to shatter that lie. It is to look at one's skin, hair, and body and know, this too is sacred. This too reflects the divine. The gods carried African features because the people who imagined them carried those same features, and in their likeness they found holiness. But the deepest healing comes in the body and the spirit. Where empire taught shame, the gods restore reverence. The body is no longer sinful, but a temple. Sexuality is no longer cursed, but fertility's blessing. Dance is no longer lust, but prayer in motion. Drumming is no longer rebellion, but communion with the cosmos. Every act once condemned regains its holiness when seen through ancestral eyes. This healing is not only personal, it is collective. Communities reclaim rituals once outlawed, festivals once disguised, songs once whispered. Together they rebuild the broken link between past and present, between ancestors and descendants. The gods remind them that their story did not begin with slavery or colonization. It began with civilizations that built pyramids, mapped the stars, and honored gods who ruled life and death. And healing spreads outward, for when people reconnect with their sacred roots, they move differently. They walk with pride. They speak with power. They resist oppression not only politically but spiritually, knowing that their very existence carries divine legacy. The gods whisper not only comfort but courage. You are not broken. You are eternal. Yet, healing is never the end. Once dignity is restored and memory embraced, a new question emerges. What happens when the wisdom of these gods is lived again, not as fragments of the past, but as guides for the present and future? Among the most devastating erasures was the silencing of the goddesses. To conquer a people spiritually, empire did not only suppress their rituals, it attacked the feminine at its core. For in Africa's civilizations, the divine feminine was not secondary, it was central. Isis, Ma'at, Hathor, Asherah, Oshun, Yemaya, these were not side figures in a pantheon dominated by men. They were builders of worlds, guardians of truth, healers of wounds, givers of life itself. Isis was the archetype of love's power, resurrecting Osiris through devotion, protecting Horus with magic, healing the broken with compassion. She was a goddess who proved that nurturing was not weakness, but the force that conquers death. Ma'at, with her feather of truth, was not a symbolic figure. She was the principle that even pharaohs bowed to, the assurance that justice governed all existence. Hathor embodied joy, music, and fertility, reminding humanity that beauty and pleasure were sacred, not profane. In West Africa, ocean ruled rivers and sweetness. Yemaya mothered oceans and children, their waters nourishing generations. To honor these goddesses was to affirm that women were sacred, their bodies not sinful but creative, their voices not silenced but prophetic. Society itself was built on this recognition. Women were healers, priestesses, judges, and leaders, their authority flowing from the divine feminine. Civilization was balanced because divinity was balanced. Empire could not allow this. To impose patriarchal control, the feminine had to be stripped of power. Isis became a myth dismissed as pagan, even as her image lived on in depictions of Mary cradling Christ. Ma'at was erased, her principles absorbed into abstract laws divorced from her name. Asherah, once honored alongside Yahweh, was cut out of scripture, her sacred groves destroyed, her memory condemned. Oshun and Yemaya were called witches, their rivers demonized. In one stroke, women were reduced from divine partners in creation to silent vessels of obedience. But memory is resilient. The divine feminine hid in plain sight. Mary carried Isis's face, even if stripped of her power. Folk traditions preserved Oshun's laughter in songs and Yemaya's presence in ocean rituals. The image of Ma'at survived in scales of justice carved into courtrooms. Though diminished, the mothers of creation never vanished. Today, they return with force. Women reclaim Isis as a symbol of endurance, Ma'at as a guide for justice, Oshun as a source of beauty and power, Yemaya as a mother of healing. To honor them is to honor not only divine balance, but the women who carry their legacy. In a world still fractured by patriarchy, their wisdom offers a path back to harmony, truth as balance, motherhood as strength, beauty as sacred, compassion as divine. The wisdom of the mothers teaches us that creation itself is feminine as much as masculine, that life flows not from domination but from cooperation. And as their voices rise again, they challenge us to remember what was stolen and to live differently because of it. And if the sacred feminine is rising, then so too is the memory of how empire turned this wisdom into sin, how it twisted joy, sexuality, and balance into tools of control. Before erasure, life itself was holy. To plant seeds was to honor Osiris, to sing was to call on Hathor, to dance was to pray with the body, to love was to partake in creation's mystery. Sexuality was celebrated as a divine force, fertility as a blessing, laughter as sacred joy. Women's bodies were honored as vessels of life, and men were not condemned for desire but guided by Ma'at's principle of balance. In this worldview, there was no sharp line between sacred and ordinary. All was infused with divinity. But empire could not control a people whose lives were already holy. A people who saw God in rivers and drums, in lovemaking and harvest, needed no priests to mediate. They needed no empire to dictate. And so the sacred was redefined. What once gave freedom was recast as sin. The body was the first target. Once celebrated, it was now treated as shameful. Where Isis taught the holiness of motherhood, empire reduced women to silent vessels. Where Hathor honored joy, empire condemned pleasure as temptation. Where Oshun ruled sexuality as sweetness, empire branded it lust, something to be repressed rather than celebrated. Men, too, were stripped of sacred power in their bodies. Strength was no longer divine, but sinful pride. Unless bent to obedience, nature followed. Rivers, once sacred to Oshun and Yemaya, were stripped of their holiness and turned into resources to be exploited. Fertility rituals tied to earth cycles were outlawed as witchcraft. The drum, once heartbeat of creation, was banned as devil's music. Dance, once prayer, was condemned as lust. Empire systematically dismantled the living connections between people and their gods, replacing them with rigid obedience to written law. The new theology was built not on balance, but on fear. Fear of sin, fear of judgment, fear of bodies, fear of freedom. Where Ma'at had weighed hearts with truth, Yahweh demanded submission. Where Osiris promised resurrection, empire threatened eternal damnation. The people who once lived in harmony with cycles of life were now taught to live in suspicion of themselves. The impact was devastating. Generations grew up believing their ancestors were heathens. Their joy was sinful. Their bodies were corrupt. Their gods were demons. Spirituality shifted from liberation to control, from rhythm to silence, from harmony to hierarchy. What had once been empowerment became chains of guilt, and yet, even under condemnation, fragments of the old ways endured. The sway of hips in hidden dances, the beat of drums disguised as folk music, the pouring of libations passed off as custom. Even in the shadows, people found ways to honor the sacred life empire called sin. This twisting of the sacred reveals why erasure was so effective. It did not only silence gods, it rewired human experience itself. But repression always creates hunger. The more joy was condemned, the more people longed for it. The more the body was shamed, the more its holiness waited to be remembered. And that hunger for wholeness is what fueled the hidden altars, where the gods survived beneath empire's gaze, waiting for the moment to rise again. When empire declared the old gods sinful, their worship did not vanish. It went underground. The people who once honored Osiris, Isis, Ma'at, Shango, Oshun, and Yemaya built hidden altars in the shadows of conquest. These altars were not always of stone or gold. Sometimes they were carved into memory, disguised in song, or carried in the body itself. Though the conquerors thought they had triumphed, the gods were only waiting in disguise. In Africa, stories became the hiding place. Elders told folk tales of trickster animals and clever heroes, but beneath the surface were fragments of divine wisdom. Proverbs preserved Ma'at's balance, teaching children cosmic justice without naming her. Songs carried the rhythm of the Orishas, their beats disguised as harmless melodies. Every tale told by firelight was a coded prayer. every proverb a seed of survival. Across the ocean, enslaved Africans preserved their gods in ingenious ways. In Cuba, they paired orishas with Catholic saints, cloaking Shango in Saint Barbara, Ocean in Our Lady of Charity, Ogun in Saint George. In Brazil, Candomblé carried the gods under Catholic imagery, their festivals appearing Christian to outsiders but fully African within. In Haiti, Vodun flourished, its W honored through prayers that borrowed Christian words but spoke with ancestral power. Even under watchful eyes, the gods breathe. Songs in the fields became maps and messages. Spirituals like wade in the water held double meaning instructions for escape, but also invocations of Oshun's rivers. Swing low, sweet chariot was not only Christian imagery, but Anubis guiding souls home. Overseers thought they heard hymns of obedience, but the enslaved were calling their gods in coded language, hiding divinity in plain sound. The body itself became an altar. Drums, banned by fearful masters, re-emerged in hand claps and stomps, rhythms pulsing through bodies like hidden thunder. Dance, forbidden as sinful, returned in sways and steps disguised as recreation. Even funerals, conducted under Christian ritual, smuggled in ancestral practices, libations poured, prayers whispered, ancestors invoked under the cover of sanctioned ceremony. These hidden altars were not weakness, they were strategy. They preserved what empire sought to annihilate, ensuring that when the time came, the gods would rise again. Every disguised offering, every coded song, every secret dance was an act of defiance, a declaration that divinity could not be erased. History testifies to this survival. The Haitian Revolution was sparked in part by Vodun ceremonies, where drums and spirits called enslaved people to rise. Across the Americas, the gods hidden in altars and songs inspired courage, unity, and rebellion. Their survival was not passive memory but active resistance, and today, as the altars emerge from hiding, we see that the gods were never truly gone. They were preserved by ancestors who risked everything to keep them alive. Their devotion was a bridge across centuries, carrying the black gods through darkness into the light of memory once more. The hidden altars remind us that erasure was never total, and now that the masks fall away, the gods step into the open, no longer content to whisper in shadows but ready to speak with thunder. For generations, the gods lived in masks disguised as saints, hidden in songs, cloaked in rituals. But shadows cannot contain eternity. The time of concealment is ending. Across Africa and the diaspora, the black gods are being spoken aloud again, their names chanted without fear, their images painted without disguise, their power embraced as truth rather than shame. The unmasking has begun. In Brazil, processions for Yemaya filled the seas with white flowers and candles, a radiant declaration that the Mother of Oceans still reigns. In Cuba, Santeria ceremonies call Shango with drums that no longer hide, thunder rolling openly as his domain. In Haiti, Vodun priests stand in daylight, leading ceremonies where spirits of ancestors guide communities, not in secret but with pride. These traditions, once scorned and persecuted, are now claimed as cultural and spiritual treasures. In Africa, temples rise again. In Nigeria, Yoruba cosmology thrives as orishas are taught not as relics of folklore but as living guides. In Ghana and Ethiopia, ancient philosophies are studied, reconnecting young people with wisdom erased by colonial education. Kemetic spirituality resurfaces as seekers rediscover Ma'at, Osiris, and Isis as teachers of balance and renewal. The gods are no longer whispers in the past, they are anchors for the present. Even in the West, where erasure was deepest, their return is unstoppable. Artists reimagine Osiris and Isis with unapologetic black features, challenging centuries of Europeanized divinity. Scholars trace biblical parallels back to Africa, proving that resurrection, judgment, and creation were not inventions of the Bible but inheritances from African gods. Social media spreads this truth globally, dismantling the monopoly of whitewashed spirituality. The unmasking strikes fear into institutions that thrived on silence. For if Osiris was resurrected long before Christ, then Christianity's central claim is no longer unique. If Ma'at governed justice long before Yahweh, then moral authority is no longer confined to Israel's God. If Isis embodied divine motherhood, then Mary is not the only sacred mother. To recognize these gods is to expose how empire built its faith on appropriation and erasure. But the unmasking is not about tearing down one faith to replace it with another. It is about remembering plurality, balance, and truth. It is about restoring the understanding that divinity has many faces, many voices, and that Africa's voice was the first to speak. The gods do not rise to conquer, but to heal, to remind humanity that the sacred was never limited, that the heavens were always full. Once unmasked, they cannot be unseen. They live again in festivals, in prayers, in art, in scholarship, in communities reclaiming pride. The gods walk with us not as fragments of history, but as living presences, reminding us that erasure was never the end. And as they return, their voices carry more than memory. They carry medicine, the power to restore what empire broke, to heal wounds inflicted by centuries of silence. For remembrance is not only revelation, it is recovery. The unmasking of the black gods is not a local event. It is not confined to rivers in Brazil, temples in Nigeria, or ceremonies in Haiti. It is global, rippling across continents, unsettling institutions, and awakening memory in places where silence once ruled. For when the gods rise, they do not only restore rituals, they restore dignity, they reshape identity, and they confront the structures of power that thrived on their erasure. In Africa, the return of ancestral gods is more than spirituality. It is a reclamation of history. For centuries, colonial narratives painted the continent as empty, waiting to be civilized. But the unmasking of Osiris, Ma'at, Isis, Shango, and Yemaya proves otherwise. Africa was the birthplace of civilization, the wellspring of divine wisdom, the cradle of theologies later claimed by empire. To honor these gods openly is to dismantle the lie that Africa contributed nothing to world spirituality. In the diaspora, the return is deeply personal. Descendants of enslaved peoples find in these gods a healing that slavery and colonization tried to steal. To honor Oshun is to reclaim joy. To honor Ogun is to find strength in survival. To honor Anubis is to make peace with death as transformation, not terror. The gods give back what was stolen, a sense that identity is not broken but rooted, not shameful but sacred. In the West, their return unsettles centuries of theology. Universities now acknowledge the parallels between biblical narratives and older African myths. Artists challenge whitewashed depictions of God and Christ with black divinity. Activists invoke ancestral gods in struggles for justice, tying modern liberation to ancient wisdom. The black gods return not only in temples but in movements, reminding the oppressed that spirituality has always been a tool of resistance. The unmasking also forces a reckoning with power. If Osiris already ruled resurrection, then empire built its story on theft. If Ma'at already weighed truth, then morality is not owned by any one faith. If Isis already embodied divine compassion, then patriarchal religion was never universal. To admit these truths is to confront the machinery of colonization, which used theology to justify conquest and erase ancestry. And yet, the return is not only confrontation, it is expansion. It opens space for humanity to recognize that divinity was never narrow, never exclusive, that God has many faces, many voices, many names, and Africa's gods were among the first. The unmasking reminds us that heaven was never empty, that the sacred was never silent, that erasure cannot extinguish eternity. But if the gods are remembered worldwide, then the journey does not end with revelation. Memory is only the beginning. What remains is the awakening, the choice to live by the truths the gods embodied: balance, justice, harmony, and the sacredness of life itself. We have walked through silence, through kingdoms and myths, through erasure and disguise, through hidden altars and unmasking. We have seen how the black gods, Osiris, Isis, Ma'at, Anubis, Shango, Oshun, Yemaya, and countless others were condemned, renamed, stolen, and yet never destroyed. Their stories survived in whispers, their rituals in shadows, their power in memory. And now, as their masks fall, they rise again not only as figures of the past, but as guides for the present. The awakening begins with truth, to remember that before the Bible was written, before Yahweh was proclaimed, black gods built civilizations. They taught resurrection before Christ, justice before prophets, creation by the word before John's gospel. They showed humanity that the sacred is not limited to one name, one book, one people. The gods remind us that spirituality has always been plural, rooted in Africa, carried across oceans, whispered through time. The awakening deepens with healing. To reclaim these gods is to reclaim dignity, long denied. It is to know that black skin was always divine, that the features of Africa were always sacred, that the ancestors were never cursed but blessed. It is to release the shame imposed by empire and embrace the holiness of body, earth, joy, and life itself. This healing does not only mend individuals, it restores communities, reconnects generations, and rebuilds bridges torn apart by conquest. But awakening is more than remembering or healing. It is living. It is to embody Ma'at by seeking truth in a world flooded with lies. It is to honor Osiris by refusing to believe death is final. It is to channel Isis by healing and protecting. It is to invoke Shango when thunder calls for justice, to walk with Oshun when rivers flow, to feel Yemaya's embrace in the ocean's tides. Awakening means weaving their wisdom into our lives, not as myths of a forgotten past, but as forces shaping the present. This awakening is dangerous to systems of control, because a people who know their gods cannot be enslaved. A people who remember their ancestors cannot be erased. A people who see the divine in themselves cannot be shamed. This is why the gods were forbidden, not because they were false, but because they made humanity free. And so the choice now rests with us, to close our eyes again, to accept the narrow story empire wrote, or to awaken to speak the names, to honor the faces, to live the truths of the black gods who built civilization before the Bible. For they are not gone. They are here, in the soil, in the rivers, in the songs, in our very blood. The awakening is not coming. It is here. The gods are rising, and with them, so do we.